My video presentation concerns the inclusivity of children's literature. I would like to discuss the problem of diversity that the publishing industry is facing at the moment, based on the conducted research. First of all, I will be looking at the statistics gathered in recent years and presented in the industry reports. Secondly, I will explain why the diverse representation in children's literature is important and what steps the publishers are undertaking in order to change it. So, what is diversity? Diversity describes a variety of different social groups, based on, for example, ethnicity or religion. Even though the term is not limited to just these groups, in the following presentation I will concentrate chiefly on racial diversity. There is a number of articles that address the problem of underrepresented protagonists from different social groups, especially pointing out the BAME protagonists, which brings the reader's attention toward the predominantly white industry that affects the identity of the characters in children's books. The report, published in April 2019 by Book Trust, the biggest charity in the UK, which concentrates on reading culture, reaching out to 3.9 million children every year, compiles the research which shows how largely people of color are underrepresented in children's literature. It demonstrates that in 2017, only 5.6% of children's authors and illustrators were people of color, among which roughly 2% were British people of color. To emphasize, authors and illustrators from minorities had twice less books published than white creators, and they are more likely to self-publish their work. As can be seen on the diagrams, the trend in the last 13 years in the British publishing industry is rather stable, and authors of colors are largely overgrown by white authors, besides the diverse multicultural and multiracial society the United Kingdom accumulates. The data gathered in the release puts in spotlight the demography of the country that is not reflected in the publishing industry, where authors of colors remain in minority. Therefore, the characters featured in children's books that represent people of color are underrepresented. Another study of ethnic representation in children's books was committed in 2018 by CLPE, an independent British charity that puts the focal point of children's education on quality literature. The survey stated that out of 9,115 children's books published in the UK in 2017, only 391 books featured BAME characters, out of which only 1% included BAME character as the main protagonist. To show the comparison, in 2017 roughly 33% of all school children in the UK were of minority ethnic background, as reported by the Department of Education. The organization continued to monitor the changes, and in September 2019 released the second report, which showed the slight increase of titles representing BAME protagonists among books published in 2018. Out of over 11,000 children's books published that year, 743 included characters from minority groups, which demonstrates a modest rise from 4 to 7%. Similarly, there was an increase in the number of books which included BAME character as the main protagonist, from 1% in 2017 to 4% in 2018.
I think every publisher, I'm probably not wrong to say, has put inclusion much higher on the agenda than they did previously, and that's partly from social media pressure and sort of the lobbying pressure. And actually the statistics around diversity in children's books now exist in a way they never did before. That only 1% of children's books in 2017 featured a BAME character as the main character, and that statistic came out. There was a lot of, I think, catching up that some of the potentially bigger publishing houses, started to do, or thinking that they must. The trouble with publishing is that there are very long lead times. So a book you can put into play now, if you can contract a book now, it might not come out for 2 years. So time is, change is slow, and particularly in a big bureaucratic machine like a big publishing house, change is necessarily going to be slow. Also, ones who rely on agents to get their submissions, it means that the agencies themselves need to go through that process of change and getting new voices in representation before they can pass them on to the publishing industry.
These changes were rather small and insignificant. Nevertheless, the findings of this report inspired many to establish new organizations or puts to life New initiatives, such as for example Nights Off's Round Table bookshop in London, or social media campaigns, such as We Need Diverse Books and Read the 1%. It also brought attention to independent publishers, such as Lantana Publishing, Tiny Owl, or Alana Max, which were already working on the improvement of inclusivity and diversity in children's literature. The report called to action larger publishing houses as well. To illustrate, Penguin Random House set up a program called Right Now, which helps mentoring the underrepresented authors. As part of the research, I talked to Alice Curry, a founder of Lantana Publishing, an independent publishing house which specializes in diverse and inclusive children's picture books. Lantana was founded in 2014 with the mission statement to publish the books which reflect children from diverse backgrounds, because all children deserve to see themselves in the books they read.
We are an inclusive children's book publishing house. We work with authors and illustrators from underrepresented backgrounds to publish children's books in which all children can see themselves reflected. We work around the core pillars of diversity and inclusion, social equality and environmental sustainability. As part of my remit for my freelance work and also within my academic studies, I had become very aware that there was a real gap in the children's book landscape, whose voices got to be heard, whose didn't, and sometimes it was a case of some voices being essentially just ignored. Sometimes they were more actively silenced, so it might be a question of a lack of infrastructure around a publishing tradition in a particular country, say, or it could be something more insidious like institutional bias or potentially racism. So on a professional level, I've been quite aware that this gap was there. On a personal level, my sister married a man whose family had emigrated from Hong Kong, and my soon-to-be-born little nephew Ryan is obviously mixed race. He is one of around 2.5 million school children in the UK who identify as Black, Asian or minority ethnic. And he was faced growing up without being able to see himself in the books he read. It was the same year that We Need Diverse Books, as a campaign originating in the States, launched as a hashtag for the first time. It was the same year that Walter Dean Myers, is an author, a fabulous African-American author in the States, wrote a very impassioned sort of piece in the New York Times saying, where are the children of colour in children's books? It was very much, I think, the beginning of a wider conversation around the lack of diversity in children's literature.
CLPE report also analyzed another very important issue and crucial aspect in the conversation about children's literature: the content. It pointed out that often BAME characters are drawn with the exaggerated features of their ethnicity, which makes them seem ludicrous in comparison to the white protagonists. These stereotypical portrayals lack the authenticity and solid research. Another key point is the subject matter of the books with diverse characters. A big majority of them deal with the problem of homogeneousness itself, raising the issues of discrimination and racism. Whereas it is important to publish books that concern social issues, they shouldn't be the only ones on the market. Children want to read about a variety of topics, including fantasy, adventures, tales, facts about surrounding world, and many others. Books need to be diverse, not only by depicting diverse characters, but also by discussing diverse subjects.
I read like fantasy books or something.
Do you really?
Yeah.
And do you think that the character looks like you?
No.
I've been reading Fancy Nancy. Well, she's white, but I like that her and her friend are friends, but her friend is an African American.
Oh, interesting.
And it's almost like me and my neighbor friend.
I was aware that of the books that were being published that dealt with diverse themes, or whatever you might want to call it, a very large percentage were either biographies or histories or sort of, what we'd call issues books about, for instance, civil rights movement or something, or sort of looking at ideas of racism, all of which are incredibly important and should be there, but there wasn't the same breadth of choice as you would get in any book that was about a majority culture. So you'd rarely see, a black child going on an adventure, or just like having fun, or and still the statistics around funny books, like books for children that are just fun and funny, are there's far fewer of them that have diverse protagonists than books with white protagonists. As soon as we set up, as soon as I incorporated the business, created a website, the submissions started flooding in almost immediately. Any kind of marketing we had done to make ourselves visible meant that we were sent submissions straight away, and we're very privileged because a lot of those submissions started their submissions saying we are exclusively submitting to you because finally someone is looking for our voices, or you are welcoming the kind of writing that we are bringing. I also, as a sort of a backup, I started by writing to some authors who I personally admired, either in other countries, potentially people who hadn't been introduced to the UK market, but who had a presence elsewhere. And I wrote to them personally and I said, look, I've just set up this new house. We want to focus on voices like yours. Could you give me some advice? Do you have any author friends who you might want to sort of send our way, or do you yourself have a manuscript? And our first ever book, in fact, was on the basis of me writing to a fantastic African-American author called Nnedi Okorafor. She wrote Chicken in the Kitchen, which was our first ever book, and the way it came about was that I wrote to her. I had actually written about some of her other old books for older readers during my PhD, actually, or post-PhD, in an article I published in a journal, and I sent her the analysis of the books, and I just said, by the way, I'm thinking of setting up a publishing house and I want to focus on writing like yours. Could you give me some advice, I think is what I said. And she came back saying, well, would you like to see a manuscript? So this was Chicken in the Kitchen. It went on to win the Children's Africana Best Book Award, which was our first ever award, which took us to Washington to an award ceremony at the Smithsonian and a book reading at the Library of Congress. And I just thought, well, you know what, people are really crying out for books like these.
The designer has to be mindful with the depiction of the characters. As articulated by the animation studio Cabeza Patata from Spain, it not only requires frequent inclusivity of diverse characters, but also it needs a more general transformation in visual communication in order to change the biases the audience has and their response to it. To clarify, if the picture represents a disabled person, the non-disabled person might think it is only addressed to people with disabilities. In my opinion, the same change should be happening in the publishing industry, where books with underrepresented characters, for example from BAME minorities, shouldn't be addressed just to the BAME audience, but more broadly to all the children. Frequent representation of underrepresented characters in children's literature will not only allow children from minorities to be able to relate more deeply with the book itself, but it will also help breaking the biases and changing the general response from the audience. Creating thoughtful and diverse books will help transforming the perception that including the characters from minorities is only addressed to the selected group of people.